For the last several weeks, we've been dealing with this topic of unclean hands out of James. And today, we want to talk about this concept that Jesus presented, that explained that it's not what goes into a man that defiles him or makes him unclean. It's what comes out of him, evil thoughts. And so today we're going to deal with the whole concept of adultery. And if you believe that adultery is cheating on your spouse, then make sure you stay tuned for this entire video. Thank you for joining us on today. For the last several weeks, we've been looking at this passage out of James chapter 4, verse 8, where the scripture says, draw nigh unto God, he'll draw nigh unto you. Cleanse your heart or cleanse your hands. That deals with the washing of the hands. He says, purify your hearts, you sinners. And so we've been dealing, really addressing the cleansing of the hands, which we understand is not our physical hands, is not these hands. But God is talking about our spiritual man that needs to be cleansed. And so we go to our scripture in Matthew. We have this passage of scripture here in Matthew chapter 15, where Jesus began to explain that it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a man, but it's what comes out of the mouth that causes a man to be made filthy or dirty. He said in Matthew 15, verse 18, but those things which proceed out of the mouth come forth from the heart, and they defile the man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man, but to eat with unwashed hands defileth not a man. So the passage of scripture that we want to take a close look at is verse 19. So at verse 19, once again it says, for out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts. Now, we looked at thoughts of murder on last week because we're dealing with thoughts, not the physical action. But this week we want to deal with this topic of adultery, which many people define as being in a marital relationship and one spouse cheating on the other. But what's very interesting is there is an individual that we are warned in the New Testament scriptures not to be like. And there's several passages of scripture that presents this warning, and they always use the same person as their example. And what's very interesting is whenever I've presented this teaching, most people would say that the individual is David. Now, let me explain this to you. David did not commit adultery. Now, of course, I know you're familiar with the story of what he did with Bathsheba. We would say he was a murderer, he was an adulterer. But here's the thing, he asked for forgiveness. And so in God's eyes, the whole process of forgiveness, the whole process of grace, helps us understand that in God's eyes, it's as if it never, ever happened. And so the scripture explains to us that we are called to be stewards of God's grace. What does that mean? It means that I'm to be a manager of the grace of God. It means that I'm supposed to release God's grace to individuals. And so when a person has asked for forgiveness, I, like God, am supposed to look at that individual as if that sin had never happened. And I know many of us do not process in that way, but as we're coming into the likeness of Jesus Christ, we pray these prayers, Lord, I want to be more like you. Or this is one of the areas that we need to be more like Christ. As we walk in forgiveness and forgiving others of their past trespasses, we don't continue to hold those things against them. And so David was one that asked for forgiveness. So in God's eyes, he is no longer a murderer. He is no longer an adulterer. And of course, he did suffer the consequence for the actions. He had set a whole sequence of events in place, and the baby died. That was the consequence of that act that David did. But as far as God's concerned, he's not holding that charge against David anymore. So who's this individual that we are warned not to be like, that we equate with adultery? This individual is Balaam. His story can be found in Numbers chapter 22. Balaam was not a part of the nation of Israel, but he was one that would sacrifice. He did hear God speak to him, And so there was a king that came to Balaam asking Balaam to curse the nation of Israel. And of course, the story goes that he asked God for permission to go as they brought him reward. They brought him different things of money, status, clothing, things of this nature that Balaam was really interested in. And of course, the Lord spoke to Balaam, told him that he did not want him to go. And Balaam prayed again as they came back with a second time, offering more things. Balaam prays, and at this point, God says to him, he says, if the men return, then you can go with them. And this is what got Balaam in trouble. If you read this passage of scripture, it says that Balaam, the next morning, saddled his things and went with the men. And so Balaam did not do as God had instructed him. The instruction was if the men returned. Balaam took that word from the Lord to say, I can go. Because in his heart, what he really wanted was all these items and things that they were offering him. And so he was not obedient to God. And of course, he goes with these men. The donkey that he's riding on pins his leg at one portion of the journey between the donkey and the rock. And it began to hurt his leg. And of course, he begins to beat the animal. And the animal turns to him. The mouth of the animal, the donkey, opens up and begins to speak to him. And of course, at this point, Balaam's eyes are open. The angel of the Lord speaks to him and told him that he had been sent to kill him. And so he was instructed to only prophesy what the Lord spoke to him while he was there. This, of course, is what Balaam did as he would fall into trances. He would bless the nation of Israel, which made the king extremely angry. And of course, Balaam wanted the reward. He wanted all the things offered to him. And so what he did, because he could not prophesy over them, not a curse, he decided to now give words of wisdom and counsel of how to get the nation of Israel into trouble. And he did this by introducing women from other nations into the nation of Israel that now required God to come in, judge the nation of Israel, and get them in trouble with God. And so I'll read through that passage of scripture in Numbers chapter 22 as well as 23 to understand the full story of Balaam. But now let's go to the book of Jude, where we have our first warning that I want to look at, and then we're going to go to the book of Peter. And so in the book of Jude, it says, woe unto them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, and ran greedily after the error of Balaam for reward, and perished in the gainsaying of Korah. Now, this whole passage deals with lasciviousness, which I don't want to deal with on today. And you may say, well, there's no connection at this point between adultery and Balaam. But when we go over to the book of Peter, we have the same exact warning, but Peter gives a little more insight. We'll look at 2 Peter chapter 2, beginning at verse 14. He talks about those having eyes full of adultery and that cannot cease from sin. They have the inability to stop sinning. Beguiling unstable souls, that's how he defines them. And heart, they have exercised with covetous practices, cursed children. And at verse 15, which have forsaken the right way. So they've gone into their own path. They've forsaken the way that God has laid before them and are gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Bosor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. This is what's interesting is Peter is taking the sin of adultery, and he's really equating it to Balaam. And this is interesting. When you look at Balaam's story, there is no indication of a physical sinful act in regards to any sexual behavior. There's no mentioning of a wife. There's no mentioning of him cheating on his wife, which leads us to understand that in God's eyes, adultery is so much broader than a man cheating on his spouse. What's interesting is Jesus said that if a man looks on a woman, and of course we could broaden that and say if a woman looks on a man with lust in their heart. So the issue is lust. And what is lust? Lust is greed. And that's what we see here in 2 Peter, as he's equating the sin of Balaam, which is greed or covetousness, is really the root of adultery. So this is what's crazy is a person will stand before God and they'll make the argument and say, well, I've been faithful to my spouse. They may even go as far as to say, well, I've never even looked at a woman and lusted in my heart regarding her. And yet in God's eyes, you could still be an adulterer. Why? Because the root of adultery is covetousness. What's interesting, if you look at the law of Moses, so he says, do not covet thy neighbor's wife. And then he goes on and broadens it. He says, do not look at his children. Do not look at his manservants. Do not look at his donkeys and his substance and his wealth. And so we understand that covetousness goes a lot deeper than just lusting at somebody's spouse, but it does deals with our eyes as we're looking upon somebody's substance, the wealth that they've accumulated, their things that they have. This area of the heart can be evil in God's eyes. How do we avoid this sin of adultery, which is the root, of course, covetousness? This is easily avoided by following the law that Jesus instituted, which is to love thy neighbor as thyself, which is really an echoing of what Moses had said to them. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. If I love my neighbor, I will never look at their things and desire it because I'm excited for my neighbor gaining things in life. I'm excited for their success. I'm excited for their promotion. There's nothing in my heart that will cause me to be jealous or despise them or be angry or upset at things that they've accumulating or the success of their marriage or things of this nature. And so it's important that we follow this law that Jesus has established. And if we do this, then we can stand before the Lord and with a clean and honest conscience say to the Lord, I am not an adulterer. My hands have been cleaned. My heart is clean. My heart is pure in your eyes. And God will not judge us as so. I would like to thank you for joining us on today, for taking time out of your schedule. Please go back and watch last week's video, Thoughts of Murder, as we dealt with the first portion of what we covered on today. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, please. Visit our website, hisgoodtreasure.com or dariusgood.org. For all of our music stuff, visit our entertainment website at goodtreasureent.com. And join us again next time. And until next time, I pray that God will open unto you his good treasure. Be blessed.
March 15th, 2019. It's my daughter's 18th and the phone rings. The name that displayed on my phone screen is the Brother Good, so I took it as a track thing. Nah, what he proceeded to say to me had me in disbelief, didn't want to receive. He told me that